afternoon, everybody. It is
Good.
Monday.
I don't have any.
What is the day today? May 20th. This is the regular meeting of the Eugene Planning Commission. First item on the agenda, public comment. If there are any members of the public here to speak. Planning Commission reserves 10 minutes at the beginning. Doesn't look like we have any. All right, all staff. So with that, I think we'll get right into item B, which is our work session on urban reserves. We have Rebecca.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Whoa.
It has been about a year since I came to the Planning Commission to provide an update on urban reserves, and a lot has happened in that time. So we have an hour and a half for this agenda item, but I am hoping to talk for a half an hour because I don't really like listening to myself talk. And I have two members of our ETAC who are also on the Planning Commission who have heard me talk a lot. And so I'm going to try to go through our outline pretty quickly and then spend plenty of time for questions. So I'm going to do a little bit of background to bring us all up to speed.
Just a little closer?
Sure.
Thank you.
I'm used to talking really loudly. Does that work? So I'll do a little background refresher and then see if folks have questions, and then go through our technical analysis, which is the meat of the presentation, and then talk briefly about the suitability analysis that we're moving into. But before I do that, I want to have our members of our project management team who are here today. I'm doing this. Introduce themselves. They have been working really hard with me on this project over the past year and a half, and we couldn't be doing it without them. So I want to acknowledge them and have them introduce themselves. You want to start, Lindsay?
Sure. Lindsay Eichner, Lane County Planning. Terry Harding with Long Range Planning. Heather O'Donnell, working on growth monitoring, Long Range Planning. I'm Laura Cirilli. I'm not part of this project team, but I'm the project manager for the Audrey Stewart, Long Range Planning.
Thea Evans, GIS Analyst.
Emily Jerome, Deputy City Attorney.
Thank you, everyone. And let's just jump right in. So you're very familiar with this. This is our vision map and our Envision Eugene pillars. It shows our UGB, our downtown key corridors, and the neighborhoods where we live, work, shop, play, go to school, etc. So Envision Eugene implementation reached a major milestone with the adoption of the UGB and part of the comprehensive plan back in 2017. The UGB adoption process occupied the majority of the planning team's work plan for many years. Since the state acknowledged our new boundary last January, we have turned our attention to implementation projects, including urban reserves. So that's what we're going to focus on today. This is super high-level overview. This is just some of the purpose or goals of urban reserves, which is to provide a 10 to 30-year supply of land for possible future expansion outside of a city's urban growth boundary. It's meant to help provide cost-effective provision of public facilities and services once land is brought into the UGB using the urban growth boundary process. It also provides more certainty. It provides more certainty for landowners, service providers, local jurisdictions, because those urban reserve areas have been designated and identified as the areas that our community is going to potentially urbanize into. So those are some of the high-level goals of this project. So why are we doing this now? It's important now for a number of reasons. As everyone is familiar with, our housing supply and affordability is already a critically important issue for our community. We've been directed by City Council and the County Board of Commissioners to prepare an urban reserves proposal for city and county consideration by January 2020. This is aligned with the work of our growth monitoring program, which you can see here, and Council's review of the first growth monitoring report the following year in January 2021. At that point, Council can consider a UGB expansion onto urban reserve land if there is a need to expand at that time. This is important because without urban reserves, future UGB expansions for housing would likely be limited by state law to exception areas and non-resource lands. You may remember from the UGB process that our studies showed most of these lands are extremely expensive to serve and may not meet our community's needs. Urban reserves doesn't limit us to these exception areas, and it provides more and better options for future urbanization. Again, these are the goals of the project. So this graph shows our UGB planning period of 2012 to 2032, and then it shows the urban reserves planning period, the full extent of the planning period of 2032 to 2062, and how Eugene is projected to be growing during that time. So this shows an additional almost 34,000 people during the 20-year UGB planning period, and an additional almost 49,000 people during the full 30-year urban reserves planning period. It also shows a 2062 population of over 262,000 people, which is an additional approximately 70,000 people added to our community between today and 2062. So one of the things we wanted to highlight here is that one of the assumptions that we are using is that we have been directed to use is to use the most current population forecast available. One of the changes since the last time we came here is that there's a new population forecast. Portland State University issued a draft 2019 forecast, and previously there was a 2015 forecast, which is what we were using. These numbers include the 2019 forecast numbers, and I will elaborate on that more in a little bit. Oh, look at that. So this is just a super quick rundown of folks that we're working with. Our technical advisory committee, the ETAC, has met 8 times already since October. We're working with a whole variety of other interest groups, committees, stakeholders. The county is a clear and important partner in this project because it is being co-adopted by the city and the county. So this is just highlighting those relationships. And this is our outreach graphic. This shows you where we are in the process, that we're finishing up our technical analysis. It shows the major project phases in the middle. It shows the project committees, planning commission, council, and board of commissioner meetings on the bottom, and significant public engagement opportunities along the top. So as I said, we're currently completing our technical analysis phase, and we are moving into our option development over the summer. There's a very clear line here. The line isn't truly that clear. There is a shift of the work that we are doing. Some of the key things is that a proposal is due, as I mentioned, to City Council and the board by next January, which is highlighted on here in red. And following an agreed upon urban reserves area, we will go through the formal adoption process with hearings and a decision targeted by the end of 2020. So I'm going to highlight a few of these areas and then walk you through some of the key pieces of our technical analysis. So I mentioned the ETAC. This group was developed through policy and advises staff on urban reserves and growth monitoring projects both. They're reviewing our technical information that we are using to inform policy decisions. They're a staff-level advisory committee appointed by the city manager, and there are 13 folks who serve on that committee. There's a list of committee members included in your packet. And they have met 8 times since October, and they are a very committed group. They have gone through spreadsheets after spreadsheets after detailed maps to get a good handle on the background and the detail of our technical analysis. We also have convened a service provider working group, which we've actually split into internal service providers primarily serving within the urban growth boundary, service providers primarily serving within our study area, which is outside of the urban growth boundary. Their importance is twofold. They're helping us evaluate service provision in the study area for our suitability analysis. They're looking at the ease and cost of serviceability in all of our study area sub-areas. And also, ultimately, when we decide where we will be having urban reserves, we will be developing intergovernmental agreements with service providers. So they serve both of those processes, or purposes, excuse me. And we've met with these folks 3 times so far in the project. We also held our first Triple Bottomline Sounding Board meeting in the beginning of May. These folks, this is a new model to have project-specific sounding board groups, but it is a model that is based on the city's Triple Bottomline sustainability framework. And so they are looking at the project ultimately through the lens of social equity, environmental stewardship, and economic prosperity. And we gave them, excuse me, this first meeting was a lot of background information so they could get up to speed on the project with a number of prompts, draft analysis prompts related to these topic areas so they could help us in the future evaluate the project with that lens. Does anybody have any questions about that background, timeline, setting the stage before we move into our technical analysis discussion?
Oh, okay. Commissioner Baker.
Just one question. The growth management information, and from a scheduling standpoint, when would that information be available and plugged into the urban reserves planning?
So the first growth monitoring report is due to council in January of 2021. So that's when our aim is to have urban reserves established at that point. So then if council looks at the growth monitoring data and says that there is a reason to evaluate whether we should expand the UGB, then we have urban reserves set aside to potentially expand into.
Yeah, that's what I expected, but my one consideration is could there be some differences in lands that are more suitable for multifamily development than single-family development? So that would sort of affect I don't know if that's being looked at.
So,
Because, for example, if the growth monitoring plan indicated that was a higher need for multifamily, then we would have land available for that would be suitable.
So urban reserves is looking at the already established policies that we have established through the UGB process in order to move efficiently through the process and basically just say these are the areas that we are setting aside for potential future UGB expansion. We're using our existing policy assumptions. If there are new policy assumptions that the council would like us to consider based on the growth monitoring information, then we can make those policy changes at that point before we do potential UGB expansion. So for efficiency measures, that type of thing, we can make those changes at that point before we expand our urban growth boundary into those urban reserve areas. Does that answer your question?
It's good.
Okay. Does anybody have anything else they want to add before I move on? Okay.
All right. Just let you know, I think that your question, Commissioner Baker, may relate to some degree on the specific types of land need that you looked at for urban growth boundaries. So looking specifically for what types of housing we really need or what types of industry we're expecting to attract. Urban reserve law is kind of a higher level look. And so the specific statute or administrative rule provisions that we looked at for urban growth boundary that talked about suitability in terms of an urban growth boundary are kind of much higher level at urban reserve. So we don't expect that the nuances and the more specific kind of data that you're going to get from growth monitoring would be usable under state law in identifying urban reserves because it's so much further out. So it's a bigger look, and then that stuff comes into play again for urban growth boundary, but you won't see that specific provision from law in front of you in this project.
Good, thank you for clarification. So this is a summary of our technical analysis, and it simplifies it into 6 steps. It's actually the first 4 steps is our technical analysis, and step 4 and 5 are more our suitability analysis, which are the option development phase, which we're moving into. So I'm going to quickly cover, I'm going to try to quickly cover these first 4 steps to explain what we've been up to over the past year. So the first step of our process was establishing a study area for urban reserves. It looks similar to the UGB study area, but it's broader. Instead of being a half mile around the UGB, it's at least a mile around the UGB, except at the river and I-5, and also at the Metro Plan area boundary in some areas where that is wider or goes out farther than 1 mile. So the study area was consistent with our urban reserves guidelines or state rules, and also with the new rules for establishing UGB study areas, so that our hope is that that will enable us to streamline our UGB process as we move forward, since our study area is the same size that is that the rules call for UGB analysis. So we coordinated with a variety of partner agencies and neighboring jurisdictions to set this, partially because it impacts neighboring jurisdictions. It bumps into the Junction City urban growth boundary. That little wiggle up at the top is going right around the southern end of the Junction City urban growth boundary. So we didn't want to surprise anybody. There's been a lot in this phase, a lot of letting folks know what this project is and what we've been up to.
Rebecca, can I interrupt really quick?
Uh-huh.
Do you mind taking questions if they come up? Because
Sure.
Commissioner Ramey had
Yeah,
a question
it's
about this in particular.
So this is the
Totally
part that
up to
was-
you.
Thank you for coming today and explaining this to us, and blanket apology for asking obvious questions.
No, you weren't here for that first
Number
round,
one,
so.
so when the urban growth boundary was established in January, of what was that year, this year, 2019?
Yeah,
By the state, when it was
2018.
accepted by the state. Was there a growth component to that as well? So there's the boundary itself, but there's nothing else, that's it?
Correct. Correct.
So the process we're going through now
Uh-huh.
is trying to set the stage for when the boundary expands again.
Correct.
And I've heard two different terms. I've heard
Okay.
urban reserves,
Mm-hmm.
and I've heard urban growth boundary expansion.
Okay, right. So urban reserves are designating lands for possible urban growth boundary expansion in the future. So those are, once urban reserves are designated, they are our first priority lands by state rules that we can look at to expand into. So, and I'll get into these land classifications, how they exist.
So there's no, there's no difference between urban reserve and urban growth boundary expansion.
There is a big difference, actually.
Okay, so that's,
So urban reserves, so the land that is designated as urban reserve land does not change. It remains rural. People can do what they are currently allowed to do on it, but it is in line for possible future urbanization. Yeah. And what we also say, future urbanization, that is also equal with possible future UGB expansion. So once the UGB is expanded, then there are different triggers. Yeah, yeah.
so then the blue dotted line,
The blue dotted line is the metro plan boundary. Yeah.
and the red line was drawn by the staff team based on their interpretation of state laws and rules.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And, I'm sorry, then you.
And this version may not be tax lot specific. I can't remember if this version is. That version is
looks like
not,
it's more
but it is more now.
And you said there was an in-between, this is further than something,
So the study area
study area thing.
for when we analyzed the area around the urban growth boundary for possible expansion last time, the study area was similar to this, but it was approximately a half mile from
Okay, so the last time we drew the black line,
the red line. The black line is the UGB.
right, and the last time we did that,
Mm-hmm.
we had a red line, some of which became black and some of which did not become black.
Correct. We
So
had a
now we're
study
drawing
area
new red
too.
line, and we're saying, okay, we're gonna study for the next time.
Right,
Got it.
right.
Okay, Commissioner Baker.
Oh, wait,
Yes,
did you have a, oh.
So I had a question about this too. It was mainly about annexation.
Mm-hmm.
It would be useful maybe to have I don't think the black line is the boundary for the city of Eugene, is that correct?
It's the urban growth boundary,
so
not the
it's the
city
city.
limits.
Right.
It would be useful to see the city limits as well.
Yeah, it'd be useful to see the city limits because there's an issue of, always an, potential issue of annexation and
Sure.
so, and I was just wondering how that might affect urban reserves planning. Obviously, if an area outside of the urban growth boundary, but adjacent to the city limits, decided to annex, whether that would have any impact on the urban reserves area.
So it would only be those areas within the urban growth boundary that would annex into the city limits, and that wouldn't have any impact on urban reserves. Because urban reserves is at
Strictly
least
outside of-
2 steps away from that. So urban reserves designation, then we analyze whether we want to bring those areas into the urban growth boundary. Then people who are coterminous with the city limits have the opportunity to annex into the city limits.
So we don't have any past history of property being annexed in the city limits that wasn't in the urban growth boundary?
That was not within their, not to my knowledge.
Not here. That has happened in other jurisdictions, and it leads to odd relationships. We regulate against it.
Okay, just wanted to get some confirmation.
Yeah, I think it's probably helpful actually to keep the annexation and the urban reserves question separate because they're really very different questions. Yeah.
Yeah, we have a handout that we've provided to community members who often have similar questions about how is this going to affect me, that shows the sort of three levels. You're inside the city limits, you're inside the urban growth boundary, and you're inside potentially the urban reserves area if we designate it, and how that impacts you in terms of property taxes, schools, services, that type of thing, because it's a multi-step process and it's complicated. So part of developing our study area was looking at where our priority lands were and classifying or categorizing them within our study area. So without urban reserves in place, if urban reserves are in place, they are priority one land for potentially expanding into. When you don't have urban reserves in place, this is the priority classification system that the state has set up. So those first priority lands to consider are exception areas and non-resource lands, and often they are they're basically lands that aren't farm and forest lands. So they are often rural residential. They're often already developed, but they also include big land areas like the airport and LCC. So schools are allowed. Marginal lands are also considered non-resource lands, and those are the priority two lands. They're not, it's not the same classification, but they are lands that are considered lower resource value. And so they are the second priority lands that we look into. And they are often already designated as residential uses by the county. The third priority lands are those resource lands, so forest and agricultural lands. And we categorized this when we were identifying our study area boundary because the rules dictate how you develop your study area based on where these types of first priority lands are. Not to get into too much minutia, but I'm happy to come back to it. You can see in some areas right at the edge of our boundary, there are little fingers of these rust-colored first priority lands that extend out, and that's because if they're at the 1 mile boundary, then the state tells you to continue evaluating those first priority lands as far as they are contiguous, because there are non-forest and not farmland, so they're our first priority to look into when we get to that point.
Go back just 1 second. People were asking what the little white dots here and up there are.
Those holes, Thea, can you help with that?
So, this line is tax lot specific, so it's just the way that those like down at the bottom left, it's the way that tax lot is shaped. It actually goes all the way around. So because it touched the 1 mile boundary, it was within the study area. But it's just an odd shape. And then up at the very top, that has to do with what Rebecca was saying in terms of the priority one resource land jutting out, and then the shape of the tax lot that's kitty corner to it, but not technically touching.
So, but why did it not get a shade? Oh, okay.
So it was not within the study area, but the tax lot that was almost completely surrounding it due to the shape of it was
Right.
within the study
Okay.
area.
Some of the,
Mr. Ramey, did you have a question?
The relationship between this identification is that if you do not have urban reserves, you need to start here first.
correct.
That's it. Right?
If you do not have urban reserves and you are looking at expanding your urban growth boundary,
Go to
then
these types.
you go to those types first. And you're looking at you're looking at expanding incrementally, usually. And so those are the areas that you are required to look at
The urban
first.
reserve process allows us to change that. It's like, be more strategic about that. Rather than just going here, we can consider other things.
We still have to consider these first, but we can also consider other things. And then, once we have urban reserves, it's all first priority. Yes, thank you. That's excellent clarification.
Thanks.
So after we set our study area, or really at the same time as setting our study area, we contracted with Eco Northwest to help us update our land need model. And I say update because it's based on the land sufficiency model that was developed for the buildable lands inventory for the Envision Eugene process. But instead of looking at whether we had sufficient lands within our urban growth boundary, we're looking at our land need outside of the urban growth boundary. So this is a multi-page model, which is many different spreadsheets. And this is a very high-level roll-up of results. Now, remember, again, the state directs us to look at up to a 30-year urban reserve, but we could also set aside land for 10 years of population growth. So anywhere between 10 years of population growth and 30 years of population growth. So we have the numbers that we can plug in estimates for any size in between, but this is high-level summary information showing the range of land needs if we are creating an urban reserve between 2032 and 42, 32 and 52, or the 30-year need, 32 and 62. So you can see the range of need between 1,800 acres and about 5,800 acres.
Commissioner Baker, you have a question?
Yeah, this is where my question about growth, what do we call it, growth monitoring comes in? Because obviously this would be affected by, say, the split of multifamily versus single family, the amount of land you would need for housing. Maybe it would be, and it might actually, there might be some impacts on employment and other, depending on how we're building in the future.
Right, so
There's some assumption built in here. What assumption is that?
so these assumptions are the same assumptions that we used for the urban growth boundary analysis. So it's the same housing mix. It's the 55-45 single-family, multifamily housing mix. It's the same density assumptions because we don't have new data yet to go on.
Right.
So we're moving forward. Go ahead.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, we're moving forward those policy assumptions. And because this is a very high-level estimate, this is starting our analysis in 2032. So we know that it's not exactly precise, but it's the best information that we have now. So then, if we get direction to set aside a range of land within this range, then when we decide or council directs us to evaluate growing into those urban reserve areas, with our urban growth boundary, then we can identify whether we want to make changes to those policy assumptions.
Okay, well, again, I would feel much better if you had these numbers, but normally when you're projecting way in the future, you do sort of a, you know, a low scenario and a high scenario. In other words, if you take the same information and say this is the 55 whatever split, and then you show the similar, you know, some curves or numbers that show a 45 or a 65, in other words, you know, like we do for climate change, you know, you show you know, and a high scenario, what we assume is the middle and a low, because, you know, we're going so far in the future, it gives you a much better idea about what the potential difference might be if those things change. Because right now, you don't see any of that here.
Right, so the
So
assumption.
that would be easy to do, it seems to me, because all that is a few number crunching and a couple more tables.
So,
Graphs.
so one of the places that decision makers have for flexibility is in this size of urban reserves. So instead of saying, well, we're going to change the mix of housing types without having direction from council on how to change that, the place that we have flexibility on what to change is the size of urban reserves based on the years that we are projecting for. So if there is less certainty about these numbers and how things might change, then you could choose a larger urban reserves because you feel that you may need that area in the future, or you could do the reverse. So this gives you a range instead of guessing.
I consider that sort of driving blind. I mean, in other words, if you want to adjust that, you want to know, have some reason why you might adjust that. So if you had different, say, for example, multifamily, single-family splits, and then, you know, a counselor or someone else looking at the future can look at that, and let's say we get our growth, you know, monitoring results in 2021, you could see that you could, you know, it would be reasonable to make that adjustment. Otherwise, you're just adjusting those numbers blind. But you
Well,
would
let me
lose-
just step in and just interrupt for just a minute. I think we want to try to continue to just get through this, and maybe we can come back to this, because I think that these numbers, we've been going on an assumption and using these numbers for multitude of reasons. So I just didn't want to, I don't know that this is the place we want to debate that right now. So let's just continue to move through here, and we can continue to ask questions and whatnot, but.
It's fine. I just think it would be easy to add that to the study. It would make it more valuable.
Okay.
So this is another way of looking at the land need and the land supply. It's looking at our population projections with this range of time between 10, 20, and 30 years, and the range of population changes and the number of new Eugenians we can expect in the community. And this overlays the land need numbers and connects those with the population growth. So this is just another way of looking at those same numbers.
Commissioner Fragla had a question, then Commissioner Borowski. Go ahead.
So we're not only using population to make these evaluations, correct?
Correct.
So can you just remind us what other pieces of information we're using? Because a lot of the charts are just showing population growth, so what
Right.
else is being utilized?
Right. So we're also plugging in Oregon employment numbers from 2017, so the most recent numbers there. And we are looking at a whole range of assumptions and inputs on housing size, vacancy rates, density assumptions, I mentioned in terms of employment densities, employees per acre, residential densities, which we'll look at some of those maps later, housing mix, the different types of housing we're expecting. Am I missing anything key? Employment mix. Right, we're also plugging in land needs for public lands like parks and schools, and semi-public lands like churches and fraternities.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Borowski?
Yeah, I just wanted to make something clear for the people who might be viewing, and maybe even some of our other things. When we talk about 10-year, 20-year, 30 years, that's from 2032. It's not 10 years from now. Okay, so what we're actually talking about is 40 or 30, 40, or 50 years from now. Just so, you know, we say 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, people might get the assumption that we're talking about 2029. We're not even starting to look at this. It's 10 years further from 2032. So just a clarification, because it can kind of sound, oh, we're going to have that many people in 10 years. No, we're looking between 30 and 50 years from today is what we're looking, or 30 and 50 years from when the UGB was adopted.
Thank you.
Right, thank you for that clarification. Yep, the expectation is in 2042, we're starting with a baseline of 16,000 new residents. In 2052, 32,000 additional residents, and in 2062, 49,000 additional folks. And thank you for the clarification on the other assumptions that we're making besides population projections.
Just clarification, those are numbers starting from 20, in other words, the second and third numbers are the additional numbers.
From 2032,
2032.
right, growth from 2032, exactly. So this is how we organized our land supply model. What we first did is we looked at whether the land in the study area was developable. And the definition of developable land from the state's rules on urban reserves is land that's not severely constrained by natural hazards or designated or zoned to protect natural resources. And it's either entirely vacant or has a portion of its area unoccupied by structures or roads. So what we did is we looked at the lands that we didn't want to develop, that were not appropriate for development, and we classified them or characterized them as protected and committed lands. Then we looked at the already developed lands and removed those from consideration of capacity. So they don't have additional development capacity that we can assume. And what we're left with are partially vacant and vacant lands to consider for potential urban reserves. So the list of our protected land in the urban reserves study area is pretty lengthy. This is land that's reserved to protect natural resources or prevent the impact of natural hazards. And so we have assigned it no development capacity, and I'll show you on the maps. So the first, I should have numbered these, but 1, 2, 3, 4. The first 5 bullets are lands that protect natural resource lands. The last 3 are more hazard lands. So we are setting aside floodway and 100-year floodplain lands. And these are important to point out because these are areas that we're potentially treating them differently for urban reserves analysis than we treat them within the urban growth boundary. But we feel that when we are looking potentially up to 50 years out for where we want to direct future urbanization, even though we allow development in our flood zone areas now within the urban growth boundary, we don't necessarily want to do that in the future. So we have removed from capacity consideration 100-year flood, those areas that have prohibitively steep slopes, so greater than 30% slope, and high-risk landslide areas, which is the newest inclusion in our protected land list, because this was new information that we recently became available from the State Department of Geology and Mineral Industries, DOGAMI, their high-risk landslide areas.
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, just a quick question. So on the high-risk land areas, were any of those in areas below a 30% slope?
Yes, so the ones that were above 30% slope were already removed.
Right.
And there was about 700 and some acres that did not fall in any other category that were added to the list.
That's useful information to know that there are some high-risk areas below 30% slope, because we use that in other places like the South Hills.
Right. So we also gave no development potential for housing or jobs to committed land. So these are public and other lands that are committed to other uses for the foreseeable future. So our public parks and open spaces, schools, utilities, the airport, other government properties, cemeteries, transportation rights of way, BPA rights of way, we've all included in these maps as committed lands. Now let's look at where these are. So we flattened these for this map, just so you could see the extent of them within the study area. You can see that even though the airport was an exception area, so it's a first priority land, it's also committed to other uses. So we don't need to consider it as a first priority. So these are the areas that we're not considering for future development or considering for development capacity within urban reserves. That's the red X is mostly 100-year flood. That purple X is Spencer Butte, so other public areas. That the light blue X is the Bonneville Power Substation next to Arley Park and LCC. And so this is how this breaks out when you categorize the land. So let's see, do I have this summed up, or do I have to do the math for you? So basically, 42% of our study area, once you remove those lands, has development potential on partially vacant and undeveloped tax lots. It's important to note this acreage looks very specific, but it is actually approximate. I think we hadn't yet put in our landslide acreages into here because we added them recently. So you will see in later presentations these numbers change a little bit. But basically, 58% of the land within the study area is off the table for consideration of future urbanization. Yes?
Yeah. I think again, this is the crux of the issue here too. I think it would be valuable if you had a table, extended this table so you have the total, but then you have the numbers that are in the various categories, exception areas, marginal areas, and agricultural lands.
Sure.
So
I have that information, but not in a slide.
Yeah.
If you would.
That's what I figured. You might have it. You would have it in your, but it would be useful just for decision makers later on. You might, for example, choose the exception areas first when you were looking to, expand the UGB rather than just looking at the map. So
Sure.
you use that as one of your qualifying decision points, you'd use except nears and then marginal lands and then agricultural lands, rather than just looking at the map and seeing what's, you know.
Right, there are lots of layers on this map, and so, yes, we can show buildable or developable land that is remaining categorized by priority land
Yeah.
areas as
And
well.
you could do it in a graph, or you could do it as a table, just the areas, you know.
Sure.
And, you know.
Good suggestion.
Commissioner
Thank
Ramey,
you.
you had a question?
Just a small question about partially vacant.
Yes,
So outside the city limits, well, I'm sure, yeah, probably, there are houses on 1 acre lots.
correct.
Is that considered partially vacant?
Not 1 acre lots.
Has to be above an acre of non-protected, non-committed land.
So you have to have
Well,
about
it
a
had to be
2 acre.
above an acre.
Yeah, if you've got a 2 acre parcel and you've got a house and a barn on it, and no wetlands or anything on it,
Right.
then
That
part of that,
property,
the part that's not covered would be
the
considered.
1 acre houses that are just on 1.01 acres, they're not.
Right.
That would be, because it's still above an acre of non-committed, non-protected land. So then what we would do
Oh.
is we would say, okay, well, it's above an acre.
1.01.
Yeah, they
And
can't
then
build in the
we
forest.
would identify how much of that had building on it and subtract that and say that's existing development. But the remaining portion of the lot is still available and partially vacant.
And it's available because presumably the zoning would change to allow more dwellings per acre than is what's currently there. Right? I was
So,
wondering what the cut was. The cut's anything acre
They
and
picked
higher.
an acre, yeah.
Commissioner Baker, another.
Yeah, this is a question for our legal expert. So is that mandated by the state, that number mandated by the state requirement, or is that just a locally adopted number?
The state doesn't define what it means to be partially vacant, but we are required to consider that. So we have to come up with some standard. And I think like a lot of the other assumptions that we're dealing with in urban reserves, we're going with council's direction to use the assumptions that they made for urban growth boundary.
Okay. It might be useful to see what other jurisdictions are using, just to get an idea of if we seem to be in the mainstream or we're an outlier, or, you know, if we're right in the middle, then we feel comfortable, but.
our assumptions are much more complicated than most communities' assumptions, from what I have been told.
Well,
Or refined, I
Well,
should
and-
say, detailed and refined.
Another issue too is if there's a small number of those properties that are on 1 acre or less, then it wouldn't affect your numbers very much, then it doesn't really matter, right?
That,
In other words, if the number of properties in that area, in this potential area, there are very few of those properties that are 1 acre,
that are fully developed.
one acre,
Right.
you know, 1 acre, or, you know, we say between half an acre or 3/4 of an acre and 1 acre with a single house on them. There are very few of those properties, and so there's a relatively small area. It's not worth dealing with either.
Most of the acreages are on larger,
Yeah.
most of the tax lots are larger.
That's the point I'm making, yeah. If it's a small number, we don't worry about it.
Thank you. This is just another way of looking at the developable acres versus the full size of the study area. We've also put it in comparison with the acres that are included in the UGB, just for comparison purposes. So there's about 36,000 acres in our UGB. That compares with a study area of about 26,000 acres. So the area that we're looking at with potential future development capability is about 11,000 acres. Then these 3 slides to the side show the different range of need depending on whether we're looking for a 10-year urban reserve or a 30-year urban reserve, how that splits out between residential land, public land, or employment land.
Just another quick question, if that's okay.
Sure.
What is on our current UGB, how much of the land would be considered developable? In other words, it's not parks, or do we have a sort of a rough number for that too?
That is still, that's vacant or partially developed?
Well, yeah, I mean, the graph is useful and it shows you how much you have to reduce it from the potential land, right? But it would be useful.
It shows you how much you need that is within the developable areas.
Right, but I'm just saying, in the UGB itself, what is that number?
Do we know what that number is?
But we're talking about urban reserves.
I know.
Yeah.
I know.
And I don't have that number off the top of
No,
my head.
it's just,
Yeah,
it's just,
let's-
that it'd be useful in getting an idea if this is what you normally expect when you do urban growth expansions. You know, you lose 20 or 30% because of, already committed land, for other purposes. So it's not quite as stark.
So let's just, I want Rebecca to be able to get through this. So let's, if we can, just hold our questions to the end. If it's really important and it's urgent, then.
We are getting close to the
Okay,
end of
'cause
the
it sounds like
technical
we're-
analysis. We just have a couple more slides that I'm thinking might engender some additional conversation.
Okay.
So this is what we call our part of our capacity analysis. So we're combining our land need and our land supply and looking at capacity. So we are not assigning uses to these specific areas of land in the study area. We're simply identifying whether there's enough land with specific characteristics to potentially meet the different needs that have been identified in our land need analysis. So since low-density residential makes up the majority of the urban reserve's land need, we ran this analysis on here using the same density assumptions that are documented in our land need model and that are pulled forward from our UGB assumptions. And they are based on the actual densities achieved inside the UGB between 2001 and 2012 approximately. So this isn't, these aren't our goals. This is based on reality, what has been built on the ground previously. So really what it shows you is on a general scale how you can see hopefully the copies that you have are more clear than this, but just how the density is spread around our study area. So for example, this coral area is 4 dwelling units per acre. And you can correlate the coral areas that you see on the map with those are tax lots that are over 5 acres in size, less than 5% slope, and below 900 feet in elevation. So we have our general density assumptions, and then we have more refined density assumptions based on what type of land we would be bringing into the urban reserves. So this is simply for analysis purposes. Here's another piece of our capacity analysis where we looked at industrial lands. While low-density residential makes up the majority of the urban reserve's land need, what was that number? So for a 30-year urban reserve, our single-family land need is about 12,000 dwelling units. So that makes up our biggest land need. But industrial land has certain characteristics that are different from residential or commercial land. So we wanted to make sure that we had land within our study area that could potentially meet the needs for industrial lands. this is probably a good point to, or a good point in the presentation to say what I think I failed to say, which is once we designate urban reserves, they're simply urban reserves. We don't have areas for housing, areas for industrial. Even though I'm showing you this analysis, this is simply background information for us. So we know, okay, look, we can accommodate these types of uses. Once it's designated, it's simply urban reserves. And then when we need to expand our urban growth boundary, depending on what we need to expand for, we can look at those different areas within the urban reserves that might be appropriate for those uses. I think I failed to say that. So this is basically looking at these different characteristics that we have identified for industrial lands. And these characteristics are either from state rules or they are from our UGB analysis work. And these are the criteria that we plugged in. And you can see the different sizes of tax lots that we have meeting this criteria, and the distance of these tax lots from a freight route corridor, which was identified with our urban growth boundary expansion as a criteria for industrial capacity. And we have a need of about 900 and some acres of industrial land. And what this shows us is that we have in excess of about 2,600 acres of land that could potentially be suitable for industrial lands. Now, this is a very high level first look. We didn't look at adjacencies. We didn't look at our suitability analysis, which is the next step in the process. This is just the first hit, giving us a high level idea of whether we have available land for potential industrial capacity.
Did you say 2,600 or?
20, so that showed 2,600 acres, and we have a need for about 900. So this is showing you both the detail there. What I am glossing over is the extensive amount of work that mostly Thea has done to create this geospatial land model for urban reserves from a variety of data sources that were not initially meant for that use, matching up land designations and boundaries to be tax lot specific and for our capacity analysis. A lot of our work over the past year has been creating and refining the methodology for that and doing that work. That's on the right. What we're moving on to the left is trying to take this large study area of 28,000 acres and breaking it down into sub-areas for analysis purposes only. So we've organized it in a similar way to how it was organized for the UGB analysis, but now the areas are much larger. And we're using it in order to update to develop our suitability analysis, and it's how we have organized our serviceability conversations. Our service providers have provided us information based on these study areas so that we can have a more, I don't want to say bite-sized, but that's what I keep thinking, so that we can focus in on more specific areas and actually do some comparison, use them for comparison purposes as we move forward, mostly just for organizing our analysis. That was not very succinctly put, I apologize. So that is the end of what we're calling our technical analysis. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just another suggestion again, and I think you've done a great job. I'm just trying to make it what I would consider even better. The industrial capacity, I think, again, would benefit by showing it by exception areas, you know, a table or something that shows the area by exception areas, marginal lands, and agricultural lands, just for future decision makers. I mean, if it turns out you could meet all the 900 acres using exception areas, then you would, you know, you might not consider going to the marginal lands or the agricultural lands. I mean, I'm just saying, you know, that's an issue. And I just had a question. I don't have any complaint about it, but I was just wondering whether the no residential plan designation for the industrial lands, whether that came out of the state. Because some of these lands are probably county zoned, and they may have happened to have a residential designation, but they may be, some of them might be completely vacant. And so, given their location, it's, anyway, that was, you know, a potential thing to maybe think about. And then I have one other question I'll throw out now, and then let other people go too, is in the population analysis, was the consideration made of the change in age demographics as in the future, where we'll have more and more seniors? You know, a larger proportion of the population will be seniors, and you know that might affect the size of the units, the kind of units that they, you know, people over a certain age might be drawn to.
So the population projections are from Portland State University, and those are the required forecasts that.
For numbers or for population split within the age groups?
So they take into consideration a whole range of demographics, including age ranges and birth trends and in-migration, that type of thing.
That's what I'm trying to get at, is not the absolute number, but the split within that number of people that are, say, seniors rather than, you know, non-seniors, because that might affect the size of the units that people might be living in.
Got it.
Okay, so it's not the number, but it's the split within that of how many people would be, you know, seniors, might have different housing preferences.
Okay, thank you.
Are we, Commissioner Fragla, are we,
Did you want to finish the sustainability?
I just
I could leave my question until after the sustainability piece.
okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yes.
So, like I said, we are, we have created a phasing process for our work, which we have neatly called technical analysis and option development. It really sort of merges together. So a lot of the pieces that I have showed you are the technical pieces that are that we have put in place for the difficult decision making that is coming. So part of what we are doing next is looking at the suitability of the developable land that we have identified in our study area. So the direction that we have is to evaluate the developable land in the study area by considering it in terms of these following factors, and then dismissing that land that on balance would be unsuitable for urban reserves. So we've already started doing this in terms of our serviceability analysis. So locational factor number 2, which is orderly and economic provision of public facilities and services. We've already started using our serviceability information from our service provider working group and organizing our analysis by sub-area. And we are moving into a more detailed suitability analysis across the study area based on these locational factors. Once we have determined which lands are suitable for urban reserves, then we will go back to this priority land classification system that we've been discussing and bring in those lands that both are developable and suitable in this order. What we're planning on doing is coming back in the fall with a range of options showing different urban reserve alternatives based on this analysis for some conversation and decisions. And, oh, that's where we are here. So we'll be coming back in the fall, like I just said, for your input on our options. And then we just put some prompting questions in that I don't think you need based on all the questions
Right.
in the packet. I realize that this has been a lot of information and it's a challenge for me to summarize it in a way that makes the most sense for you. So thank you for all the good detailed questions and let me know what I've forgotten.
Commissioner Fragile.
I think you did a great job, and I found the different maps that you broke down to be really helpful. So I had a question about timeline based on the new perspective that Commissioner Borofsky provided. So if we're looking at this 30-year period after 2032, can you provide me with a timeline that talks about how we're re-examining the UGB in 2021? So is it because it's such a long process to look at expanding the UGB that we start to look at it in 2021, even though we're thinking we won't need these additional lands?
Until 2032.
Yeah.
So you might want to jump in, but I will start. Basically, we're looking at whether we're growing faster than we thought we were going to be. So that's why we're
Which
relooking
I've
at
seen
it
a lot of
in
indicators that we are, right?
Right. So did you want to?
Sure. So back in 2015, when we went to council and they gave us the direction to establish the what ended up being the 2017 baseline UGB, set up urban reserves, start that project, and have that an option to council by January of 2020. They also said to start the growth monitoring program and recognize that that would be a whole new system for us to put together. So we're gradually doing that, and we should have a report to council in January of 2021, so a year after urban reserves would be established. And so what that allowed us to do is to continue developing the growth monitoring program and collecting the data in the way that we need it, which was the challenge before. We didn't have ways to collect the data established at that time, while also getting urban reserves in place by using the assumptions that we used in Envision Eugene and the 2017 urban growth boundary. And so we just did our first growth monitoring report, or a couple of charts to the ETAC last month ago. And that is just the first of many. And so really you need all of the data to be able to plug in all of the inputs into the land model and go, okay, now let's check in and how are we doing? Are we growing faster? Are we
at the same densities, because some of these things could neutralize each other, and not that I have any expectation that we'll be exactly on target of how we assumed we would grow, but if you are growing faster and less dense, then those things can neutralize each other. Or if you're using more land in one area than you thought you would and less in the other, again, those can neutralize each other. Or they could all be off. So we really need all of the data to then be able to, like all of the assumptions that Rebecca listed that we're using in the land model, we need all of those to be updated for us to have a complete picture of where we're at.
Right, that was really helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, because one of the things I am curious about is how, what developable, bleh,
Yes.
developable,
There you go.
thank you, inventory are we using, land inventory are we using to make these decisions, right? And that's obviously going to fluctuate. And I kind of know what we've been using, but we also heard a recent presentation by Urban 3 that talked about, are we really evaluating it based on density accurately? So, I'm just curious, like, what we're going to be looking at in terms of density when we start to ask ourselves these questions and look at adding the reserves into the UGB. So.
Yeah, and I kind of think about the growth monitoring as kind of a two-step. So the first step will be checking in, where are we at? We assumed this for our vacancy rate, and now we're seeing this. We're seeing this, we assumed this density, and now we're seeing this. And so then the next step is to input all that into the model and say, okay, where are we at? So what does that mean if we use all of these assumptions and rerun the buildable lands inventory? How much land have we used up? We put all of that together, and then that tells us we thought we had a 20-year urban growth boundary for 2012 to 2032. We're 9 years in, or whatever, and it actually only ended up being a 15-year, or, well, actually that would be more. We only have 5 years left, right? And so we used everything up. We're using everything up quicker than we thought we would. And so at that point, council can give us the direction about, okay, well, we want to just continue those 5 years. Or they might say, okay, well, now let's initiate the urban growth boundary analysis. And at that point, we look at doing efficiency measures, because the state requires us to do that. So are there measures we can take, actions we can take to grow more densely inside the urban growth boundary? And then we talk about expansion, and that's when urban reserves comes into play. So it's really a multi-part, multi-step, more than 2 steps.
That was great. And I just wanted to say, I think my first planning commission meeting, you presented on urban reserves. So I think I might have almost been here a year now. Yeah.
Commissioner Borofsky.
Thank you for the presentation. As one of myself and Commissioner Edwards sit on the Technical Advisory Committee, and so we get to see a lot deeper. I mean, some of the maps and the things that they've done it's incredible. The technology that we have, they can zoom into a tax lot and say, there's a building on it, and this is that, and this is that, is really quite amazing what they've been able to do. So I'm just going to kind of back this up a little bit for people who are at home or myself. When the UGB was adopted, we were looking at, initially, the Technical Advisory Committee for that was looking at lands, because we thought we were going to have to bring in some other than industrial lands. We thought initially that we were going to have to bring in some housing lands. And we looked and we saw where we would have to go. And there were places like up off of Crest Drive and out Bloomberg Road by LCC. And we were looking at all these different lands and saying, okay, by state statute, these are the lands we have to look at. And some of those lands were $140,000 per lot just to get services to. But we had to Those were the lands that we had to look at if we were going to expand for housing. And so, as it turned out, there was a slight miscalculation on what we thought we had as far as buildable lands in the UGB, and so we didn't have to expand for housing, and so those came off. All we had to do was expand for parks, schools, and industrial. But that lesson that I learned from that was it's very restrictive if you just do a UGB expansion. You have to go to those priority lands. If we set an urban growth boundary and say, okay, all of this land is available if we need to expand. We're not expanding into all of it, but this is the areas that we look at first. And some of those areas may make more sense than a piece of land up off Crest Drive that costs $140,000 to serve. There may be a piece of land that might be higher priority as far as soil and productive acres, but it might be right next to a sewer line and is more buildable. So it's not phantom land. You know, the other lands, we could have brought them in and they may never get built. And that's one of the other things that we'll look at when we do the monitoring is there's been a lot of talk, you know, in the UGB talk, there was a lot of like, yes, this is categorized as a buildable land, but you would go talk to a builder and they would say, this land's never going to get built on. And so we'll be able to develop that and look at that and say, you know what, our assumptions about lands that are at 25 degrees slope, we said would be this percentage built on, and then we finding that it's not. So it's really, for me, it's just like, where do we want to expand if we have to expand 30 years from now or 20 years from now? What makes the most sense? And this gives us that flexibility to do that and bring into factors other than its soil is high value. Because if you look at that map around there, if you looked at that, everything around Eugene is almost high value soil. It's either farm or it's forest. So the majority of the land already is high value. So we're really digging into small areas that are exceptions. So that's just kind of my high level. And the amount of detail that we get into at the technical advisory committee is, you know, here, the planning commission, I would say, is 1,000 feet. We're getting down to, these people are getting down to worm level.
So Commissioner Randall, you can go ahead, and then we've got about 5 minutes, so I just want to,
Okay.
and then Commissioner Baker.
Mine, I think, will be short. I appreciate all the work that's gone into this and the analysis and that. And I guess what I see is that, you know, we're taking all of this study area and we're evaluating it down to maybe the worm level. And then at that point, we'll decide what areas are most appropriate to put into urban reserves. We will have that. We will have that data. We'll have that information so that when we get to that point, it's just a lot more efficient to expand if we do need to expand because we've got all of that data, all that information. We've already set it aside for that future development if it's needed. So we've kind of got a land bank that we're doing for the future. And so I appreciate that because then I think when we get farther down the road, we've never really done it that way. We kind of just do a big thing every 30 years and then it's a huge effort and by the time we get there, the population studies are out of date. And so this way we can stay up with it, I think, a little bit better. It's kind of like ongoing maintenance on your house or your car. And so I just appreciate that. And see if there's anything else I wanted to say. No, I think it's really just because of all this base work that we're getting established, we'll be able to be more efficient in the future. And I just appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Baker, one last.
Yeah, no, I agree with Commissioner Randall. I think this is going to be really valuable moving forward when you know, 10 years from now, you're looking at potential changes to the UGB. I was just going to ask if Heather could send us a copy of that preliminary growth monitoring data so we could take a look at and see what it's, you know, what it's indicating.
Yeah, We can do that. Right now, it's not very exciting because it's just census data. So it's actually just pulling in information from the census website that's already out there. So we haven't gotten into housing mix or density or any of that information yet because it's taking longer to develop that part of the database that we need to collect that information.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
we're looking forward to that data.
I know.
All right. Any other last questions? Well, thank you, Rebecca.
Thank
and
you.
all of you.
Thank you.
I think we're going to just take a really quick 2-minute break.
Yeah, maybe during the transition.
Yeah, we'll go ahead and transition, and then we'll be right back. Want to get through it?
Through it, unless there's like clarifying
Something that's
questions.
clarifying, okay.
But yeah, I'll
so-
try to get through it and then have time for questions. at the end.
Okay, that's perfect. So everybody just make note of your questions, and then we'll do them all at the end, unless you've got a clarifying question, okay? All right.
Okay,
Go
so
for it.
I already introduced myself, but again, my name is Larissa Varela. I'm a transportation planner in the city's Public Works Department. And I'm also the project manager for the Franklin Boulevard Transformation Project. So an outline of the presentation that I'm going to give you today is I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the project, why the city is working on it, talk about public involvement that we've done so far, share with you the design concepts, and then talk about next steps for the project. So really quickly, the study area that we're looking at for this project is Franklin from I-5 to Alder Streets. The red outline on the map can show you the study area. We're also including Garden Avenue and the streets that connect from Garden into Franklin because there's a gap in our multi-use path system. And we want to connect that gap through that project as well. And then in addition, just information for you is back in November, we completed a jurisdictional transfer with ODOT to have control over Franklin from Walnut to around the ramps for I-5. Before we just had jurisdiction from Walnut West, but now we have jurisdiction of the whole corridor on the Eugene side.
And why are we working on this project? Why is it a priority right now? So Envision Eugene, as well as our long-range transportation system plan, identified key corridors in Eugene, and Franklin is one of 6 key corridors. And the idea behind the key corridors is that we're going to invest growth in terms of jobs and housing on those corridors. So if we are putting people on those corridors, we also have to think about how we're moving those people to and through those corridors. And so Franklin is one corridor where we'll make transit investments. There's already a pretty substantial MX investment on Franklin, as well as bicycle and pedestrian investments too. In addition to that, Franklin is a really good opportunity for the city to work towards achieving our climate recovery goals. So our TSP has a goal to triple the percentage of trips that are made by foot, bicycle, and transit by 2035 from 2014 levels. Right now, you'll see it in a minute, but there are places on Franklin where there's missing bicycle facilities, there's missing pedestrian facilities, and this is an opportunity for us to enable those types of trips to happen along a pretty important major corridor in our town. A little bit of background. I don't know if any of you were here when we worked on the Walnut Station specific area plan, but there was a plan that was adopted in 2010. It was a land use planning process, and it looked at the study areas within about a quarter mile from the Agate and Walnut MX stations. And this process started when the construction of the original MX line started. We recognized that if we were going to make investments in transit, then we also need to think about opportunities for developing the corridor from a land use perspective as well. And then within that project, it proposed what's called a multi-way boulevard concept. So we're considering that concept in this design. I'll show you a cross-section of that soon. And then since the multi-way boulevard concept was what was proposed during the Walnut Station, they created a special setback for the Walnut Station specific area that would enable the city to have the ability to obtain additional right-of-way to build the multi-way boulevard concept. However, at that time, we created a setback that gave us the minimum amount of right-of-way that would be needed for a multi-way boulevard, not the maximum. Okay, so for the purpose of this project, we're aiming to create a safe, comfortable, high-quality walking, bike, and transit street, while continuing to accommodate drivers. Be consistent with adopted land use and transportation plans. Of course, that means our city plans, but we see Lane Transit District and the University of Oregon as really important partners to this project, so we're also maintaining consistency for their plans as well. And then be supportive of the changes in urban form and mixed-use development. So if you go out to Franklin today, there's a couple different construction projects going on. So the corridor is pretty rapidly changing, and in a way that it's time for the street to catch up with the new development that we're seeing on Franklin. So the project timeline, we are in the middle right now, kind of. So back in January, we had a multi-day workshop, and we created high-level concepts for the corridor. Right now, we're in the process of taking those concepts and creating alternatives, which are basically laying out the entire corridor and looking at what it could look like. At the end of this month, we're going to have a second design workshop where there's going to be a public open house. And then once we have a certain level of engineering design for the corridor, then that's when we go through the NEPA process. And what NEPA does is it's a pretty extensive environmental analysis process that it gets us ready for federal grants and essentially makes the project shovel ready if we were to get a federal grant. And then once we complete NEPA or get close to completing NEPA, we can start applying for federal grants. And the soonest you would see any type of reconstruction on Franklin is 2022. However, we will be repaving the part of Garden that I talked about during 2020. So that will be done sooner than the entire corridor. Public involvement to date. So there's a few different kind of peaks in public involvement. Those are the design workshops. So we had one at the end of January. We'll have another one at the end of this month. But there's a lot of work to do to get people to those workshops. And then also for people who can't attend, we have different ways that they can participate online. And so this is just a summary of the public involvement we've done to date. I'm not going to read them to you, but it's a lot of work getting people to the workshops and then engaging them in other ways before and after the workshops as well. So the major public involvement event that we had was the multi-day design workshop. What that is, we brought in a team of experts from different disciplines to work in the same time in the same place with the community. And so it's a really intense 4-day process where we get a lot accomplished in one setting. And it also is great because it provides a lot of transparency to the community because we literally started with the design process during that 4-day workshop. We didn't, besides the multi-way concept, we didn't have anything developed until we started the design workshop process. So what happened during those 4 days? The first night we had a kickoff meeting. We introduced the community to the project, similar to what I'm doing now. And then we asked them several questions that I'll go over. But it was really good turnout. Over 80 people attended the kickoff meeting. The university was very generous and hosted all of the events for the workshop in different buildings. So this one was at the Ford Alumni Center. And then the next day, we conducted stakeholder interviews with a number of different stakeholders. This is not an extensive list of everyone we talked to, but we talked to over 20 different stakeholder groups and helped get their input before we started generating designs. That same day, later in the evening, we hosted an open studio. So that was where the community could come in and look at preliminary designs. So this was essentially very preliminary designs, things that were created from Tuesday morning until about 4 o'clock on Tuesday is when the open studio started. It was very well attended. The consultants who do these types of workshops across the country said it was the most well attended workshop they've ever hosted, and made the comment that our community is very passionate about what we do here. And then on the last day, we had a presentation where we revealed the different concepts that I'm going to share with you. This one is also well attended. Over 70 people attended. It was a good turnout. We were happy with the public participation throughout the week. And so over those 4 days, we asked these 4 questions. One was to list the values that should shape Franklin Boulevard in the area. 2 was what do you like and want to preserve. 3 was what do you not like and want to change. And then what is missing from the corridor. And if you're interested in looking at the survey summary and the raw responses, you can go online to see the report for it. But generally, this is what we heard. And I kind of list them to like what we heard the most is on the top left. We heard a lot of everything, but then also maybe what we heard a little bit less of was the bottom right. So we heard a lot about Franklin needing to be a destination and a place to be and to be welcoming. With all of our, I think, transportation infrastructure projects, we hear a lot about safety. We heard people value convenience. It's Eugene. They value the natural environment. They want the street to be equitable for all modes, but also equitable for people of different abilities. And then they want more access to the neighborhoods and businesses than what we currently have. And then likes. A lot of people like the MX. The MX has been a really great success for Eugene and for LTD. They definitely like that. They like the range of businesses, so they like how there's restaurants, there's market of choice, high-ends, different places to go along the corridor. Some people really like the natural feature of the mill race, in addition to green open space and trees. So we also asked them, what do they not like? So we heard more dislikes than likes. There's a lot of conflicts among the different modes of transportation that are trying to use the corridor. The MX has been really successful, but it's also really crowded. LTD has several constraints along the corridor that's limiting their ability to increase capacity of the buses. There's narrow sidewalks. There's a lot of left turn conflicts. A lot of people said that when they can turn left, it feels really scary to them. There's lack of pedestrian lighting. People drive fast. It's uncomfortable. A lot of people straight up said that it's ugly. The aesthetics could be better. And it really does lack a sense of place. And then what's missing? And some of this aligns with what people valued, but a welcoming front door, the sense of place again, more opportunities for pedestrian crossings, access into the neighborhoods. There's missing bike facilities. So the corridor that we're studying is about 1.5 miles long, and there's a bike lane in 0.2 miles of that 1.5 miles. That's it. And then it could have more green space and trees than it currently does. And so based on what we heard, we generated these design concepts. And again, these are very high-level concepts. They'll be more detailed, fleshed out. At the workshop next week, there's going to be a little bit more detailed, and then that will be continued to be fleshed out as we refine the alternatives. So before I go into the concepts, this slide is missing from your handout. I added it after I printed it for you. Just revisiting the goals of objectives is to have a dedicated MX lane that can go both directions at the same time to help alleviate the capacity issues that LTD is dealing with. To change the streets so people walking and cycling are accommodated safely, comfortably, and conveniently. To accommodate motorists and freight, to improve the area for businesses, residents, and the university community. Welcome people not only to the city, but also to the University of Oregon, and then make the area pleasant, green, and well-connected for all modes. And so I'm going to show you is cross sections. But before I do that, the cross sections are really focused on what is within the right of way. But in addition to that, the consultants, the design team broke down the corridor into these different zones. So on the far west side, there's the city zone. So how does the corridor and land use transition from campus into the city? The historic campus zone, the more modern campus zone, the event zone outside the arena, the mixed-use zone where Higher End's Market of Choice and the Romania building is, and then the connections or parkway zone. So even though I'm really focused on what's within the right-of-way in these cross-sections, we are thinking about how does the street transition to the land use from an urban design perspective. So how do we design a street so that transitions well with the land use and complements the uses throughout the corridor? And so we created these 5 different street cross-sections. What is shown on this slide is a generalization of what it looks like now out there on Franklin. So Franklin is a really complex corridor in that it changes throughout its length. It's not the same throughout the entire corridor. And so this generally represents what it looks like. In some places, there's sidewalks. Like I said, there's not really a bike lane throughout the entire corridor. In some places, there's 3 travel lanes, 2 travel lanes. In some places, there is 2-way dedicated MX. In some places, it's not. So this is a generalization of what it looks like now. With all of these concepts, except for the multi-way boulevard, we are trying to stay within the existing right-of-way. And so that is one thing that we're trying to achieve our goals and objectives without extending into the current right-of-way. And so for the first option, the first one is the English Oak option. And for each option, I'm kind of going to talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of the options. So for this option, it would preserve our historic English oak trees that are in the median. So that's good. The disadvantages includes, while it does allocate space for walking and biking and 2-way MX, the pedestrian space is smaller than we have now. So it might not make the pedestrian environment as good as it currently is and could be even better with different options. The next is the multi-way boulevard option. And so because of the Walnut Station work, we wanted to honor that work and consider a concept that reflected that recommendation in the Walnut Station plan. And so this is the multi-way boulevard option. And the advantages of this option is that it really does improve walking, biking, and it has 2-way dedicated MX. It even could add parking as well, where you see that angled parking. Of course, in order to do all this, it does require a pretty significant amount of right-of-way. So right now, generally, the right-of-way is 120, 121 feet. To do a multi-way boulevard on one side of the road would require approximately 163 feet. And so that's a pretty big difference in terms of right-of-way acquisition. And then another kind of negative part of this is that if someone's trying to cross Franklin from, say, the university side over, it's creating an even larger crossing distance. So that creates just comfort and safety and time concerns too. So that's that option. The next option is the median bikeway option. So during the design workshop week, we talked a lot to the different community members, and this emerged out of those conversations. And so a lot of people said, oh, isn't there a part of Springfield on the parkway where there's bikes in the middle? And so based on that input, we wanted to create an option that reflected what we heard from the community. So we created this option that would put bikes down the median. The advantage is that there is space allocation for all modes of transportation. Disadvantages is that if we're putting bikes down the median, then there's no space for trees. So it wouldn't achieve kind of the natural environment green goals that we heard from the community. And it also makes operations complicated. So the Parkway in Springfield is different in terms of land uses. There's less destinations that people need to get to. Whereas in Franklin, there might be a student that needs to get to the New Knight campus. They might need to go to any of the restaurants or businesses on Franklin. And so it makes operations challenging in terms of how do we get people out of the middle of the street and safely to their destinations along the corridor. And then this option is what we're calling the edge tree option. So the benefits of this is that there is multimodal space allocation and there are trees on the side. Within the corridor, there may be a couple opportunities where we have enough space currently to put trees in the median, and we won't know until we lay out those alternatives. So that's this. One thing I want you to look at is you'll see the left turn lane right there requires 10 feet. And so for the next option, if we were to take away that turn lane, then it would give us more space to use for other purposes. And so this next option is called the Tree Boulevard option. The one thing about this option is that if we took away that left turn lane and there were places where people still wanted or needed to turn left, then we would want to put a roundabout intersection in where there currently is a signalized intersection. And so the advantages of this option is that it does maximize the natural landscape. So we could have plantings on the side as well as in the middle. If we had roundabouts, they actually are safer in terms of minimizing conflicts. And so it would make left turns that people consider scary right now safer. And it also creates a roundabout would create more opportunities for U-turns. So we heard that people want more access to the businesses. Disadvantages is that it may require more right-of-way than we currently have at the intersections. We don't really know until we lay out a roundabout in the space that we have, but there's a possibility that we would need more right-of-way than we have now at the intersections. And then this is just an overview of what the intersection could look like. Again, roundabouts are safer because you don't have the opportunities for T-bone type collisions. And then they also improve travel times generally because you're not sitting at a signal waiting for all of the different phases to go through. It could have an environmental benefit because there's less idling if you can just get through the corridor. I see you guys staring at this. Do you have any questions before I move on? Just about this slide.
Anyone questions on this one?
Just a quick question. So how would the bus work there?
Yeah, so we are considering two different things for the bus. One is that we are considering just putting the bus straight through the middle. So we have heard that with the new roundabout in Glenwood, LTD operations is finding it challenging to go around the roundabout. So one option is that you can kind of see that line in the middle of that roundabout. That could be where the bus just gets to go straight through. If that ends up not working from an operational perspective, the buses would have to go around the roundabout in the same way that they do with the new Glenwood roundabout.
Commissioner Ramey?
So capacity. Currently, there are 3 lanes going each way. All of these show 2, and that was a big deal last time around. So where are we on that?
There's not 3 lanes throughout the entire corridor. There are in some places. And so we don't know yet. So we will be doing modeling when we come up with an alternative to see if we can, if we need all 3 of those lanes.
The idea behind the multi-way was you had 2 that went through and then the local access lane.
Yeah.
So nobody was turning right to go into a business.
Mm-hmm.
That's how you could do 2 lanes. So
yeah, okay.
that was the assumption, God, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, whenever that was.
Yeah.
80 years ago.
Yeah, there are.
I don't know that, maybe you kind of model it differently, but unfortunately, that was like a controlling factor.
Yeah, so the way multi-lane boulevards are being designed now has changed since the Walnut Station plan was finished. We're actually looking at a multi-boulevard that goes, it's actually like opposite. So if you're going west and you're trying to access local business, you're driving east. And so it is different than what it was back in 2010.
I'm not expressing a preference for multi-way
Yeah.
boulevards. I'm only expressing a question about the capacity of the corridor.
Yeah, and we will definitely analyze that as we get closer to knowing which our preferred alternative is going to be. Okay, and then we also have these gateway concepts. So at the beginning of the design workshop, you know, as a project manager, I was thinking it would be really nice to have a gateway as people come in from Springfield or come off of I-5. But as we talked to community members in the university, they also expressed interest in having a gateway on the west side of the corridor as well, to kind of get people to recognize that they're entering Franklin Boulevard as it goes through the University of Oregon. So the University of Oregon wants Franklin to not feel like it's this major arterial on the edge of campus. They want people to feel like they're driving through campus as they're on Franklin, and that gateways on both ends would help with that experience. It also would be beneficial to have gateways because they would serve as a way to slow traffic as they enter both sides of the corridor. Okay, so this is the West End Gateway. This, again, is a high-level concept, so we would have to, there will be modifications as to where exactly this gateway roundabout would land. To orient you, I've got an aerial, so that's, if you're familiar with campus, by 11th and the MX station, that's Dad's Gate. The empty parking lot at the north is where the current multifamily housing is being developed. Do you guys all know where we're at? Okay. And so this is the West End roundabout. So one thing to note is for 11th, we would have the everyday motor vehicles go and use the roundabout to get where they need to go. 11th would then be prioritized for the MX, and as well as walking and biking. And so the MX could get through. They wouldn't need to go around that roundabout. They would just get through and then go on to Franklin. What else is that? There would be bike, so you can see them parallel to the roads, but there would be bike and ped paths around the roundabout. So we wouldn't be putting bikes in the roundabout, so we wouldn't be having them have kind of their own little bike roundabout, and they cross where the pedestrians would cross. And then the design of this, you know, at the second workshop, we're going to be asking people, like, what do you want the character of the gateway roundabouts to feel like? This one has a statue in it. I don't know if we would put a statue in it, but the community will be able to provide feedback in terms of the character of the roundabouts. And then, you know, this building, that's the university's lot where they have the building north of Dad's Gate. The idea that the design experts had is to have this like iconic building that overlooks the mill race. It, of course, would be up to the university in terms of how they want to develop that parcel. But this is a really nice concept to start with. Do you have any questions about how this is working?
Commissioner Baker.
Yeah, I just was wondering, the studies on roundabout safety, is it consistent across all speed sort of scenarios? In other words, even at high speeds, roundabouts are safer than at lower speeds. I know a lot of them have been used in lower speed scenarios as a substitute for lights. But
so when you say high speeds, are you saying like 30? So Franklin's currently posted as 35 miles per hour?
Well, it's posted at 45 miles per hour at one end. So
yeah, in the parkway. Yeah, so I mean, what the roundabout does is that it.
And realistically, you figure people drive 5.
Yeah, they're driving
So
higher more than 35.
You know, it's different than 25 and 50. So just curious about the data on safety.
Well, so with any roundabout, what it does, regardless of what the speed of the road is that it requires drivers to slow down as they're entering the roundabout. The other thing that we can do is we started elevating intersections in Eugene, and so if we wanted to slow them down more, kind of somewhere around where the pedestrian bike crossing is, we could elevate it, so that's not only just, you know, you have to slow down because you see the roundabout, but you could elevate it to require even more of a slowdown. But I mean, in terms of, I think they're beneficial regardless of the speed because you've got to slow down to get through it.
And what about crossings by bicycles? Roundabouts seem like they're really scary for bicycles.
Yeah, so you can see the key to that is make sure that you put them kind of where people start slowing down, but not in the roundabout. So you can you see where that crossing is right there? I can point it out.
Right. But is there some warning light or something that someone would press to get across? Yeah. I mean, because obviously during the day it'd be, there's better visibility, but at night there would be.
Yeah, so we haven't made a final decision on the types of pedestrian or bicycle lights that we would have. The minimum is that we would have the stutter flash, so the yellow that are pedestrian activated, then they flash. We could also, for certain intersections that have more bike and ped traffic, we could also consider a pedestrian signal. But we haven't decided exactly how they would be signalized for people walking and biking.
And also, because I attended that workshop, there was a lot of interest in making a bike connection to the river from this West Gateway area.
From the West Gateway?
Yeah, to the river path.
Oh, okay.
Another
Yeah.
connection to the river path.
I think it would be more, towards, so there would be a connection towards Onyx, and then there would also be a better connection like where Alder connects over there too. Yeah, we're definitely looking at our bicycle and pedestrian network and trying to make as many connections as possible.
Now, obviously, you only have the right of way. You have to work with neighboring property owners to make that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I'm going to put myself in the queue real quick, and then I'll go to Commissioner Borowski. I attended, I think, most of these events, and I will also be there on the 29th, and it was great participation, and I have to say that the consultant group that presented did a fantastic job laying out the roundabouts, because I really felt that when they walked us through the safety and just kind of the stats and just the facts behind how they operate, I found it very compelling. And that was that one, I'm in the picture, so I know it was there. So I wanted to mention that, and I think that might, that information, kind of as we move forward, I think obviously this group seems interested in that, but I'm a huge fan of the roundabouts myself. But I do think that just the engineering of them is helpful to kind of have, as context. So,
yeah.
Commissioner Borowski.
Thank you for the presentation. I guess since it's real close, my question would be, what do you see as the duties of this body as it regards to this project? And I say that because in the code, under planning or under planning commission's duties and powers, it pretty much goes right to this. It says to recommend and make suggestions to the council and all other public authorities concerning laying out, widening, extending, locating of streets and parking areas, sidewalks and boulevards, and relief of traffic congestion. So I'm wondering where in this process is the planning commission's role?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm presenting to you, this presentation is an information-only presentation. I'm not asking you to take any action. I'm essentially giving this presentation to City Council on Wednesday as well, so you get to see it first. I don't know if...
I'll just take a shot at that. It's basically input, feedback. The Planning Commission doesn't have a formal role in these processes. There isn't anything in there that says you have to make a recommendation. There is for land use. There isn't for projects like this. I think at the higher level of planning, when you look at something like a transportation system plan, which of course something like this is derived from that, and it's all being based on that, that's maybe where, Planning Commission would have more engagement. But for implementation projects like this, I think for a big one where there's land use issues integrated with this, because it's a really important part of the city, between the university and the commercial areas and all the redevelopment that we've been planning in that area for years and years. I think input is important, but there is no formal role far as I can tell.
Okay, I just was reading what the duties of us were, and it sounded pretty like there should be a role for us.
Yeah, from a practical standpoint, if you look at the way that that's worded, I think it was a long time ago when there was a lot less going on in the city too. And I think the role of the planning commission, if you were to look at street widenings and that kind of thing and having to weigh in on all those things, in practical terms, it would just be impossible to bring that much to you anyway, so, yeah.
Okay. All right, well, we are 1 minute over, so Commissioner Baker, I'll ask you be brief.
Yeah, no, I just had a question about the percent of ridership, what is it? Current percent of trips made by foot, bicycle, and transit. Could you give us sort of a quick little capsule about, I know our bicycle ridership went down for a while. I don't know if it's back up. I assume transit is up a little bit, but just curious about, where we are, or, where it's been varying over time.
Yeah, I don't have the 2014 levels memorized. Rob, do you?
Hello, I'm Rob Interfeld, Transportation Planning Manager. I couldn't tell you the latest, but what I would do is recommend you go to the Lane Council of Governments. Actually, it's the MPO website, so it's thempo.org. And if you go to the lower right, there's a button called Data Portal, and they have commuting data. So the challenge is it's hard to know. There's no one perfect place to get data on how people are getting around. So they report on the American Community Survey data, which is just trips to work, and it only asks you your primary trip to work. So if you use multiple modes, it doesn't have that kind of data or information. So as part of our TSP implementation strategy, we're trying to develop a sort of broader approach to measuring how people get around. That includes like LTDs, ridership data from our pedestrian and bicycle counters that over time we're deploying all around the city, and also surveys that we do. So at some point I can come back and give you hopefully a more robust answer that'll have some real information, real data, I should say, in it.
That'd be great.
Okay.
All right, is that it, everybody? Well, then I will go ahead and adjourn the meeting of Planning Commission for today. Thanks.